met him. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he did not live in a house, but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he fell down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many times it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the wilds. Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" He said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. They begged him not to order them to go back into the abyss. Now there on the hillside a large herd of swine was feeding, and the demons begged Jesus to let them enter these. So he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned.
All right, great. A little clicker here turned on. Thank you very much, Jim. All right, so just a couple of comments to sort of remind us of where we are. In terms of the section in Luke, and there kind of are, it's basically a scholarly conceit to break up Luke into certain sections. You probably have heard, or maybe not, or maybe you heard it and forgot, but even when these Greek texts were first written, there were no chapters or verses or stuff like that. So all that stuff has really been meant to be a help. But in terms of the section that we're in, it's basically around chapter 6-ish or so, up to and into chapter 9 is typically understood as the Galilee Ministry. So Jesus is operating sort of in his home region for the most part. Maybe he's making some trips here and there, but we're sort of still set in the backwoods, or the backwaters, we should say. It really will be in chapter 9 that he will turn and begin what's often called the travel narrative, which is the longest portion in the Gospel of Luke. So that kind of gives us a sense about sort of where we are in the story. We're at the end of chapter 8, which means we're coming to the end of this kind of really first phase of Jesus's ministry. And we've already seen a few things, right? We've seen confrontations with religious authorities. We've seen miraculous events, and we've heard some teaching from Jesus. So we got Luke's Sermon on the Plain back in Luke chapter 6. So we've gotten sort of some key elements that constitute really the ministry of Jesus. So just to kind of remind you again, as I was trying to make a decision, about how to parse this thing up so that we can get through all of Luke in 20 sessions. And obviously we've been doing some skipping here and there, and sometimes it's just completely arbitrary on my part. In fact, I would say it is somewhat completely arbitrary on my part. But I had to do this. We did a little bit at the very beginning of chapter 8. I believe is where we stopped back in December, and you heard a little bit about the women who are traveling with Jesus. And in my mind, I was like, okay, we'll move on to chapter 9. We'll just kind of skip through the rest of 8. And then I remembered these scenes, and I would say these are two of my favorite scenes, certainly in this portion of the Gospel of Luke. And they're just so rich. The two scenes that we're going to hit together. And basically, verses 22 all the way up to 56 kind of belong together. Now, we're starting in verse 26, but these are all, they all hang together. They're three stories, essentially, and they're basically a series of stories about Jesus and power, is one kind of broad way of seeing this. And it's about really, I think it'd be fair to say it's about the restorative power that Jesus embodied in terms of his ministry. However, the first one, the episode that we kind of just jumped, verses 22 to 25, is also a story about power, but it's the scene when Jesus is in the boat with his disciples and the storm comes up on them and he quiets the storm and they're like, who is this person? And if we'd had time to delve into that, my part of what I would have sort of pressed is that one of the points that that Luke is trying to push us to realize is that Jesus does in fact have power over chaos and death, and that's really what the sea symbolically represents, and would have represented, even though they are on a boat in the ocean. They would have had a kind of cosmographical connotation that this is an uninhabitable space, and in fact a space where deep dark powers might reside, just like ancient people would think about the desert as a place that's where the devil hangs out, right? So when I use that language of symbol, that's what I mean. So let's turn and jump in then. Then they had been on a boat and they have crossed over the Sea of Galilee, and they land in the country of the Gerasenes. Scholars are kind of divided on exactly where this is, but then they arrived at the country of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. I think the key thing to keep in mind here, and it is important as background, is that this is Gentile territory. So Jesus is now, for the first time in a kind of really explicit way, leaving sort of Jewish or Jewish dominated and entering into a space that would have been Gentile. And I'm going to say this probably 3 or 4 times, particularly in reference to this story, that there is something tantamount to an invasion happening here. That's kind of the way that this story, I think, should be understood, is that this is a moment of God invading a territory that would have been considered effectively godless, right? So this is the out of bounds territory. This is the unclean territory. This is the territory haunted and overpowered and dominated by the demonic, et cetera, et cetera. Just throw in as much of you as what you want. And we see then Jesus going in to that territory. And of course, I think we can gather a series of kind of spiritual or theological truths from that. The other thing that I think is really fascinating, honestly, about this is the description of the man that we get. And Luke's description is not as elaborate as Mark in terms of the interchange between Jesus and the man and the demonic power, but it's nevertheless still striking. So starting in verse 27, it says, as he stepped out on land, a man of the city who had demons met him. For a long time, he had worn no clothes, and he did not live in a house, but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he fell down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many times it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the wild. So there's a lot there in the description that's worth unpacking. The first thing is, just the kind of generic, maybe we should say a couple of things about the man as he approaches Jesus. First of all, he's naked, and I don't really have something here on the screen, but nudity would not have been something that was particularly looked on positively by Jews. So a guy shows up naked, number one, there's already something wrong, right? And of course, in this case, he's chained, or he's got chains of some type attached to him. Whether or not he's actually bound or not is an open question, but I think we could certainly imagine manacles of some type, perhaps on the wrists or feet or something like that. We hear though that this man has been so uncontrollable that he's had to be put under guard and chained, right? So this person is effectively a threat to their community, and their community has tried to keep control of him, even though they haven't had a lot of luck, right? Because as we hear, right, as it says in verse 29, he was put under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the wilds. So in terms of who the man is, this is someone who is an outsider to a community that is already in the like in the imagination of a Jew, an outside place, right? This is already Gentile territory, and now Jesus is about to interact with someone that even the Gentiles are afraid of and reject. So as we think about sort of Jesus going to the rejected, right, the godless, or the damned even, we get a sense about that. The other thing that I think is worth kind of throwing in here in terms of the description that maybe stands out, and it also helps us to fit into the story that's going to come after, is the state of this man as unclean. So this guy is living among the tombs, naked and chained and possessed by an unclean spirit. I mean, all those things together, but it's particularly among the tombs, right? Right. If you were a Jew and you actually walked over a grave, you were considered to be unclean. You had to go through a ritual purification of some type. So this guy lives in the tombs. So as I mentioned before, this is literally the picture that's being painted here is of the realm of the unclean, right? The realm of that realm that is in all intents and purposes has been left by God, is essentially defenseless. Now, whether or not we want to go through a kind of theological argument about this, that, or the other, does God ever leave anything, yada yada yada. Nevertheless, ancient people would have thought about this as a space where one does not go because of the demonic powers and the fact that it really has been seeded to a certain extent. And that not only is it that land, but the man himself, right? As I mentioned here, he really, because he's living there, he's basically a dead man. I mean, that's kind of the idea, right? So Jesus is confronting a man who has been enchained, encased, captured by powers that seek and effectively render him dead to his community and to what it would mean for him to be a full-fledged, flourishing human being. So as I mentioned here, when I use this phrasing of like walking dead, that's kind of what we're imagining. Now, Jesus has an interaction here with the demonic powers. And this starts here in verse 28. When he saw Jesus, he fell down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." And I'll come back because there's a little bit more interchange between them in just a moment. So do not torment me. There's a couple things to note here. The first thing is the address of this demonic power to Jesus, right? And the use of the name Jesus, the fact that this figure knows who Jesus is, this is an attempt to gain some kind of control. And this is based on kind of ancient notions that if you knew the name of a divine power, you somehow had control, or you had power over that power. And so there's something like that here that's going on. At the same time, though, clearly you could almost imagine this person voicing this shuddering, right? So they're not just addressing Jesus in a kind of generic sense. They're addressing Jesus in fear. And here is where we have a first sort of interesting irony. And I'll kind of come back to this later as we get, as we talk together about the resolution of this scene. And that's the idea that here are demonic powers who basically have been tormenting this man and terrifying this man, and they themselves are now terrified. And in just a moment, I'm going to make the point that it's their own terror that winds up killing them. They wind up effectively dying or getting thrown into the abyss, or however we want to talk about it, because of the terror that they had been inflicting to some extent on the man. They asked Jesus not to torment, right? And that word there has connotations of judgment. So I think what we can render from this is that this demonic power kind of knows what time it is, in a sense, right? The fact that the Son of Man or the Son of the Most High is showing up means that the final judgment is close at hand. And so there's a sort of begging here to not be destroyed. All right. Then we get what I think is one of the most interesting portions of this, and this is in verses 30 to 31. And again, the conversation here is not as elaborate as it is in Mark, but says, Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" He said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. They begged him not to order them to go back into the abyss. So, first of all, this is Jesus turning the tables on the demonic power, right? If they come up to him and they know his name, they're trying to assert their dominance. Jesus, in effect, turns the table by asking their name, right? So gaining the upper hand in the conversation, at least symbolically. But the appearance of this name here and the wording legion is actually very, very interesting for a number of reasons. One is that in most of the manuscripts, the term here is literally in Latin. So it's not Greek. It's actually a Latin term that's lodged in the text. It sort of shows up there and effectively is kind of transliterated. It's also the case that there is no other example anywhere else in any literature outside of the New Testament where legion is used simply to denote a number. It's almost always used with political connotations. And I think this is why I come with this idea of the politics of exorcism, because sure, this is about numbers, because the text actually gives us an editorial comment here, right, that many demons had entered into him. But there's something else at play here, and that is the fact that, well, what was a legion? A legion was the kind of military formation of the Romans, right? When you talk about a Roman legion, you're talking about an entity that typically was placed in a given region to dominate that region. And so I think what we're supposed to take from this is that what we have here, again, is a confrontation between God and the powers and principalities. And in this case, like a thinly coded sense of a connection to a power that anyone who locally or kind of during that time would have heard that, they would have immediately identified this name with idolatry, right? Because basically on every standard that a legion bore were certain idolatrous symbols, etc., and pretensions and claims to divinity and divine status. So when we talk about, kind of confrontation here with the political component, I don't just mean politics in sort of the mundane sense. I mean, it's sort of theological politics of a confrontation of kingdoms, we might say, to use some language that has been used before. On the one hand, the kingdom of God, and on the other hand, the kingdoms of this world, right? So there's something about that that's being echoed here in what's happening. So they begged him not to order them to go back into the abyss, right? So what is the abyss? This is I think, pretty straightforward and clear reference to the expected fate that the powers of sin and death would have, would know that was coming to them. There's also a really interesting irony here that I'll come back to in a moment, connected to abyss, in terms of the actual ending of our scene. And I'll talk about this as I get to the end. All right, let me make a couple more points and then I'm going to stop and we will have a conversation about the passage. So, now turning to starting in verses 32 to 33. Now, there on the hillside, a large herd of swine was feeding, and the demons begged Jesus to let them enter these, So he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. All right, so this is kind of interesting. So what exactly is going on here? So number one is the fact that, that since this is a Gentile area, it shouldn't surprise us that there are people raising pigs, right? But this does compound further the uncleanness of the scene for a Jew, right? For a Jew, pigs, pork is unclean, and the raising of pigs would not have been something that was acceptable. And of course, it also further compounds the nature of the fact that this is a confrontation with something that is considered or should be considered demonic. The next thing, the next observation that I kind of want to make has to do really with the parallel. So we get a little bit more if you go over and you read the Markan parallel. I didn't get a chance to kind of consult the Matthew parallel, but if you go over to the Markan parallel, and Mark really would be the origin essentially of this. At least that's sort of the basic, I think, sensibility that most scholarship has, that Mark is really the first one written. What you get in there is you do get a more elaborate conversation between Jesus and the demonic power, and Jesus has a kind of conversation and allows. And here we only get it, so we don't get the actual conversation, but we do get a description. Jesus actually allows the demonic power to choose its fate, right? It wants to go. It's going to have to leave the man, right? That's the key. But where should it go? Should it have to go to the abyss, or could it go somewhere else? That's kind of the idea. And so they beg and plead to go into the swine, right? Now, when they go into, I think the idea, and I think sort of the point that I'm kind of trying to make is that when this demonic entity, whatever we want to call it, I suppose, enters into the swine, I mean, I suppose you could read it that this was all inevitable, but there's no sense that it necessarily had to be inevitable that these demonic entities would eventually drive the swine off a cliff or into the lake where they would die. So in other words, they ask not to be sent to the abyss, but to be sent to the swine. They go to the swine, and once the power is entered into the swine becomes so terrified, because remember, that's what they do. They terrorize, that the swine actually drown themselves. And when they drown themselves, in a sense, they drown effectively the demonic power, and they drown. And what is water? Water is a symbol of the abyss. So effectively, they didn't want to be sent to the abyss. And Jesus decides, I think we can say, and I'm going to say this in just a minute, Jesus decides to let them judge themselves. And that's what effectively happens. They judge themselves by making the choice to go into the swine, which leads to them being destroyed by their own terror, their own terrifying ways. As I think this is a really, to me, compelling way of reading this. So the power which is the source of terror is now terrified, and they choose or beg to enter into the swine. And then the swine becomes so terrified that effectively they throw themselves off the cliff and into the sea. So, again, there are probably different ways, I'm certain, to read this text. So I'm just offering you my own interpretation here. So what exactly is going on? I kind of want to condense down all the details that I've said into sort of maybe three things. The first is that there's a certain sense here in which we can say something like Yahweh is conquering, right? If Jesus is the embodiment of Yahweh, right, or the Son, right, or the second person of the Trinity, however it is that we decide, or to be identified with Yahweh in the work that he does, there is most definitely a sense that Jesus is coming in, and what he does represents what Yahweh wants to do. And in this case, what is so interesting, of course, is that judgment is rendered, but it's not the judgment that Jesus, it's not that Jesus renders the judgment. It's rather that he allows them to judge themselves. And what they do is they literally throw themselves into the sea. They throw themselves into what would be the abyss. The second thing that I think is really interesting here, it's a clear, and it does feel to me like a real echo, and it's the echo back to Exodus, right? There's something here that sounds a little bit like Exodus, and that is, right, the drowning of the army of Pharaoh and the crossing of the Red Sea. In this case, Pharaoh is no longer the entity, right? It's Rome, right, in a sense, right, the legion. But these are the forces that enslaved the Israelites. In this case, both the Romans and this demonic power. These are the things that sort of together, in some sort of sense, collude to enslave this person. And I think we can see, actually, doesn't just enslave this one man, seems to have enslaved his community. I'll come back to that in a minute. So here then, the paradox, though, and this is, this kind of fits in with Luke, and I think one of Luke's bigger agendas, which is that the work of setting free, the work of Exodus, that God is doing in Jesus, is not just going to be for Israel. It's going to be for all, right? So we remember, and one of the cases I've tried to make along the way is that that Luke really is interested in us understanding that eventually this message is meant for the Gentiles, and of course that's kind of what we see as we follow the ministry of Jesus. The last thing is it really kind of plays off of my first point, but it's this idea that the end of death is death, that effectively evil undoes itself. That's kind of the picture that you get here, right? The very power by which these demonic forces tormented this man wind up being their own undoing. And I think the picture that we get in much of Scripture is that evil will ultimately be undone by itself. And we see, right, as I say here, we see this dramatically in the cross, right? The idea there is to put to death the Son, and in putting to death the Son, death itself winds up dying. It's kind of the way that some of the great Puritan divines spoke about the meaning of the cross. So I know I've given you a fair amount to chew on there. So let me stop for a minute and we can kind of talk a little bit together. Kinds of comments you might have.
What about the confrontation between Jesus and Satan in the desert? I mean, wouldn't that be a conflict? One of the first conflicts?
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. And that kind of aligns a little bit with this, in the sense that too is a conflict. But what we learn there, I think, is that Jesus is not going to engage in the conflict with the normal means, right? We might associate that a conflict between great powers means a clash of power, right? And that in a sense, God just overpowers someone else. But what we really see as we follow the Jesus story, right, is that it's through the humility of Jesus, right? It's through the self-giving. It's through weakness, right? Mm-hmm. That's essentially what winds up undoing the power of death, or the power of the demonic, or however it is, whichever one of those we're kind of talking about, I think.
I like that thought about this, Jesus having the power over chaos and death. Yeah.
That's right. Amen.
This sounds like a purely spiritual, demonic thing, rather than some of the passages that talk about demon possession in the Bible sound very much like epileptic fits, where someone falls down and thrashes around and that sort of thing. or psychosis, like a schizophrenic or so. But this clearly seems totally spiritual, demonic stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think of all of the sort of exorcism passages, and there's not a ton. I mean, I guess there's like 3 or 4 maybe in each gospel at the most, maybe 3. This one has the most sort of mythology, I feel like, built around it. And I don't mean mythology in the sense that's not true. I just mean that you feel like you're kind of being baptized into a situation that is definitely not normal. It's almost undiagnosable in a way that we might want to diagnose, that there's so much more going on here than maybe with some of the other kinds of episodes that you're kind of alluding to, Jim. So I think that's right. And that's one of the things that makes this kind of a unique, and the fact that we also get a response is going to be kind of interesting, because we're going to turn to the response of the townspeople. And that raises some very interesting questions about what's actually going on here as well, or at least it further expands it, I think. These are great comments and questions. Other comments or questions?
No, the only comment I would make is that poor fellow, who had all those demons, and that he was carrying all that weight. It was equivalent to driving hundreds, if not 1,000 animals over a cliff.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you just think about, that's a great just image to sit with. The depth of torment that this man, and the way that then it not only kind of bounces off the description that we heard about the man, right? He'd been chained up, not wearing any clothes, doesn't even live with people, lives with dead people, basically. And how kind of terrifying he must have been, clearly to his community because of what he was bearing. Yeah, it's a good comment. All right, let me move us forward then, because this is not the whole story of this particular scene, interestingly enough. Can I get a volunteer who's willing to read our next set of verses?
I'll read it. When the swineherds saw what had happened, they ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came out to see what had happened. And when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. Those who had seen it told them how the one who had been possessed by demons had been healed. And all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them, for they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat and returned. The man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return to your home and declare how much God has done for you." So he went away, proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him.
All right. I mean, what an interesting sort of conclusion, in a sense, to the scene, at least. And there's a couple of things to note. So I'm going to kind of break this into basically 3 parts. The first is verses 34 to 36, which is sort of the initial response and the description of the townspeople before we really hear what they think about what has happened. So verses 34 through 36. So I'll just read this again real quick. When the swineherds saw what had happened, they ran off and told it in the city and in the country. And people came out to see what had happened. And when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. Those who had seen it told them how the one who had been possessed by demons had been healed. So a couple things to note. I mean, the first, of course, is just the witnesses. And I don't really have a comment here, but it did strike me just even as we were reading through it here, that they're just going everywhere. You know, they themselves, the one who've just witnessed this, are so shocked by it that they go to the city and the country, right? So they go both into the town and then the surrounding area as well. So in effect, the whole region is put on notice, I think we could say, that something has happened. And I know this is going to sound a little bit cliche, but I'm going to draw on a Star Wars thing, and I'm just going to say there's been a tremor in the force, effectively, right? I mean, you could say like something so significant has happened that and I'll talk about this in a moment, like the status quo, there's something going on. The status quo is not going to be what it was. And that's an interesting point. I'll come back to that in a moment. So then they come back, people start to come out and to sort of see what's going on. And we get this just beautiful description of the man, right? When the people came out to see what had happened, and when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. And so, first of all, I've been talking about sort of the symbols and Yahweh's confrontation and Jesus invading. And I don't want us to lose track of the fact that someone has been set free, right? I mean, that's the simplest material truth. He's now clothed, right? He's in his right mind. And in effect, I think what we could say with those two descriptions in particular, that he really, in a sense, meets the conditions to being reintegrated into his community, right? I mean, so, and I've made this point before, and I'll keep making it. And I think this is especially the case in Luke, that almost every healing scene or every exorcism scene has a social component to it. You know, people are not just being healed from diseases, they're being healed from the ostracism and the exclusion and, you know, the variety of other things that happen to them because of those things. And so healing and setting free, all of this carries a kind of, you know, restoration to community, restoration. And then the one thing that it would be easy to miss, but it's really, I think, really important, is that he's sitting at Jesus's feet. And that is the posture of a disciple. That's the posture of a student. That's something that even that phrasing in Greek, you would find that in rabbinic texts. And we certainly find that going on in other places in the Gospels. So the implication here is that this man has not only been restored and in his right mind, and he's clothed, and, you know, he's materially been taken care of, but he is effectively becoming a disciple. He wants to follow Jesus. And that actually obviously makes sense because we hear him begging to leave. And I'll come back to that as well in just a moment. All right. But when the people in the town see it, well, they freak out, obviously, right? So they're all filled with fear. That's another translational equivalent to that last sentence at the end of verse 35 in our version. RSV reads, "And they were afraid." I like this one, the filled with fear, because it actually sounds a little bit more like what that man, right? That man was filled with demons. They're filled with fear. And this kind of gives us a bridge to beginning to understand like what's going on in their mind. Because, I mean, something extraordinary has just happened. Someone in their community has been set free, set right, can be embraced. And what do they want? They want Jesus to get the heck out of Dodge. Like, this is just too much, right? So there's a couple of different layers here. And I think we could say, I mean, on the one hand, like, they want Jesus to get out of here because basically he just destroyed part of their livelihood. Like, what happened? You know, I mean, he let these demonic power go into the swine. The swine went off a cliff into the sea. I mean, they've lost a portion of their economic well-being has been disrupted. But I think even deeper than sort of even that material condition is that even though this man was kind of terrifying and he had to be put under guard and he lived in the tombs, etc., there still was probably some kind of uneasy balance, right? There was a status quo, and this has now been disrupted. And I think there's a kind of deeper point here that I'm going to make in just a second about like there's a big question in Luke, in all the Gospels, but certainly in Luke, and that question is, will I receive Jesus or not? Will I choose to follow Jesus or not? Where do my loyalties lie, or where do they not lie? So that's sort of a question that's always in the background. And we see, of course, that there are some people that just reject Jesus because they're invested in power, or they're invested in their own self-sufficiency. So there's clearly people who are malicious to some extent in their rejection. But what we see here is a different possibility, a different condition that might lead to rejection. And that's really how I at least read verse 37. Then all the people of the surrounding country of the Gerasenes, and think about that, all the people, the entire surrounding country, asked Jesus to leave. They're like, get out of here, you crazy Jew. Like that's basically, right? They're all Gentiles, right? So they're basically like begging him, please go back to Galilee, go back to where you came from, because you have really like messed things up for us in what has happened. For they were seized with great fear. So he got into the boat and he returned, right? So he obliges their request. So their response to some extent becomes understandable, I should say, but it's nevertheless kind of tragic, right? And its tragedy is the fact that it highlights a couple things. One is what I just mentioned a few minutes ago, right? That rejection of Jesus doesn't always happen because of hostility. And that's what we will see different places, that sometimes rejection happens because of simple neglect. Sometimes rejection of Jesus happens because, we have obligations that we think are more important. And they may be good, right? Like, we have this whole section of, and I can't remember if we've gone through this yet or not, but, I have to go and bury my father, then I'll follow you, or those kinds of things. So it's not just people who are outright hostile, there are other things that can happen. And I think here what we see is that the status quo, these people are not ready, in other words, right? And this is my last point, that the people themselves, it wasn't just the man who was possessed. In a certain sense, the people had become possessed too, in the way that they viewed the world. And by setting this man free, the people, in a sense, have been set free, but they're not yet ready. They're not yet ready for that liberation. Doesn't mean that they never will be. So we don't want to foreclose on that. But I think at least this seems to me to be a really plausible sort of deduction from their response to him. Then we get verses 38 and 39, and this really kind of endearing moment, actually, right? I mean, think about, he's clothed, he's in his right mind, he's sitting at Jesus's feet, and maybe he even knows that these people are not going to let him back into their lives because he's just caused too much havoc, So the man from whom the demons had gone begged that he might be with him, begs to leave with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, return to your home and declare how much God has done for you. So he went away, proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him. So there are 2 points that I really want to make here. One is the man begging him, right? He wants to be with Jesus. He wants to be someone who is with Jesus in the way that he thinks he should, meaning leave. And maybe, as I already mentioned, he's not sure he's going to actually be welcomed back into the community, right? Are they really going to be ready to receive him or not? We don't really know what he did to them, et cetera. It doesn't tell us that. But so what are we to do with Jesus sending him away? I mean, because you could read that and be like, well, that seems kind of cruel. I think what's interesting, though, is that like this is, I mean, basically this guy is going to be the first evangelist, the first sent one. I mean, there's been other people in Luke's gospel, like the shepherds, who go out. But here again, we have someone who's sent, right? Who's in effect commissioned. And he becomes a witness to his community, and a Gentile, no less. I mean, think about that and the implications of that in the context of a sort of early Christianity dominated by Judaism, still wrestling with our Gentiles, should they be brought in, etc. If we read the book of Acts, we know that would have only been an argument that was pretty fresh, probably in people's minds, 20, 30 years at the most. So here Jesus is effectively commissioning this man in so many words: return to your home, return to your people, and declare how much God has done for you. Become a witness, essentially. And that's what he does. And this is what makes this guy a real disciple. Not being in the presence of Jesus, that's not what makes him a real disciple. What makes him a real disciple is he does what Jesus tells him to do, right? He went away proclaiming throughout the city how much Jesus had done for him. So he literally does what he's commanded. And that is almost always a mark of a true disciple in all of the Gospels, is one who obeys the word of God. All right, let me stop. Wow, I can't believe how fast our time is flying, Linda. It's already 7:45.
Well, I just wish people would not talk so much. People, the listeners here, the class.
Oh yeah, I can't believe you people. You talks. No, I want some interaction. What do you guys think about things I shared here just a second ago?
What just struck me when you were talking about this, how the demons were asked what Jesus should do with them, and the crowd told Jesus what they wanted him to do, but yet Jesus didn't give up on these people. He left this man to be a disciple.
That's right.
So it's much different than what happened to the demons who consigned themselves. They consigned themselves out of fear and misunderstanding. The other thing I think about, which is interesting to me, is why the city didn't kill this man, why he was allowed to live. That is, he must at one time have been a man of some standing and admiration, because if they sent him back into the city, he probably would be listened to. And since these were people that were former Roman soldiers, he might well have been a centurion or something.
That's possible. Yeah, I mean, it is also possible that the use of that term legion has a direct connection to the and there's one commentator who did a lot of digging around, and he noted that the standard used by the legions in the Galilee region were wild boars. And so there were pigs on their standard. And so there's a whole thing going on here with the Romans and a critique, and so that's very well could be true that this town, this region was dominated by former soldiers or current soldiers. So I love though what you said about the compassion. Jesus obliges them, but he still has compassion on them because he commissions this man essentially, right, as his witness, as his representative, and sends him into their community. And I think that's absolutely beautiful. And that really is the center of what we're going to see as we move through, I think, the whole of the Gospels, is that our call is to become people of compassion, right? Be merciful because your Father in heaven is merciful. That's really the center of Jesus's teaching. And that seems to be at the center of the way that he lives his life. Even when it seems, maybe that's on the periphery of a given scene, it's always sort of there in the background.
This story always brings to my mind this vision. The thing that sticks in my mind has always been the vision of pigs, just, thousands of them going over the cliff. All right. But I appreciate your bringing up this personal relationship between Jesus and the man, after he is, free. And this really struck me tonight about how he wants to be with Jesus
Yeah,
and doesn't want to be necessarily go back to the townspeople, but yet he does. He
right.
lays. So that's a very
right.
personal piece of the story that I've always overlooked.
That little piece there, that would preach pretty well, wouldn't
Yeah.
it? You could hear a really good sermon there, in which, like, if the preacher was like me, they might cry a little bit. All right, let's move us forward into the next story. We'll see if we can get through all of this, because this is pretty long. But this is also a really remarkable scene as well. So can I get a volunteer as well to read the first of two passages?
I'll see if I can get through it.
Okay.
Now, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. Just then, a man came. Just then there came a man named Jairus, a leader of the synagogue. He fell at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, who was dying. As he went, the crowds pressed on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, and though she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. She came up behind him and touched the fringes on his clothes, and immediately her hemorrhaging stopped. Then Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowd surround you and press in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed that power had gone out from me." When the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace."
Okay. Thank you. So this is part of a longer story. You probably would know that as you keep reading verses 40 through 56. And as I say here, this is another one of those, like, I just think this is a really remarkable passage in the text, in the Gospels. Luke mostly takes this from Mark, and Mark really is the kind of the origin. And it has a unique structure to it that Mark liked to employ actually quite a lot, which is this sort of this sandwich structure where you have a scene start and then something interrupts that scene and then the scene concludes. And so we've only heard the first and second without the conclusion so far, but that's sort of the structure. And the structural component is actually meant, the reason that you have the interruption is that the two outside scenes are kind of in dialogue with the scene inside. And so there's a couple places where we see that here, and I'll mention that in just a minute. And both of the stories, one about a young girl and one about an older woman, right? These are both acts of compassion towards women. So obviously that's obvious, but at the same time, it needs to be stated just so that we kind of see that that's a key linkage. So first of all, we can just note, right, that Jesus has gotten in the boat and crossed back over to where he was, which effectively means that he's returned sort of to the region that he's from. This is the Jewish area of the Galilee. And he runs into, unsurprisingly then, if he's back in a Jewish area, someone who is described as a synagogue ruler, right? So now when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. Just then there came a man named Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. He fell at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, who was dying. All right, so let me just kind of unpack a little bit of this. So first of all, Jairus is a synagogue ruler, which means, of course, he's a person of some repute, but probably not to be identified with sort of this group of that we've already encountered, that clearly in Luke stands for, the opponents of Jesus. So even though he would certainly come from the religious elite, we might say, he is not necessarily a Pharisee. And I think Jairus and his place, and the fact that you have Nicodemus and some of it kind of gives us it helps to put a break on our thinking that all the Pharisees were all bad all the time, or that all the religious authorities were all bad all the time. That's not necessarily the case, even though there was a significant amount of anger and a hostility towards Jesus from those circles. So the title here most likely means that this guy is a well-respected person in the community, if he's considered a synagogue ruler, or a synagogue elder is another way that could probably be translated, and more than likely a wealthy person, because you're not probably going to rise to that level without some level of wealth, which is interesting because if he's a wealthy person, that means he would have the money to try to find a cure for his daughter. So that tells us if he's coming to Jesus, he's probably expended. And this is one of the things that then links him with the woman that we're about to hear, the older woman who has spent all of her money as well. So he comes and he begs Jesus to heal his only daughter. And there's a couple things that we can kind of note here that I think are important. And they give us, again, sort of the social location of what's sort of the implications, in other words, of these descriptions. So this man is concerned clearly for his daughter, but the fact that she's described as an only daughter, there's something else here also at stake, right? If she dies, there is a real possibility that we don't know. Maybe this person has other children, but we don't really know that. But the fact that it's underlined as only, at the very least, we have the implication that if she were to die, that the possibility of furthering the family line, especially if it's matrilineally determined, that is at risk. And so the request here is for the healing of this girl and for the wholeness and the future viability of this family. And I think that needs to kind of be kept in mind so that we kind of see. She's described as 12 years old, which would put her right on the doorstep of marriage, and becomes an interesting mirror. If she's right on the doorstep of marriage and childbearing and the kind of productive years, the woman that we're going to hear about in just a second is on the opposite end, right? But both are sort of in these precarious situations, and Jesus is kind of engaged them in those spaces. I'm going to just mention this here because it's germane when we turn to the woman, but local healers would have been a normal phenomenon, and typically healing people who practice the healing arts would have had some combination of sort of local or folk healing, access to certain spices, certain things, but also magic. So there's clearly magical incantation. I mean, there are tons and thousands of little texts that have been found in Egypt and Palestine of little magic incantations that were meant to be used effectively like an elixir to deal with certain kinds of ailments. So the implication, though, is that Jairus would have, if he's a synagogue ruler, would have had the money to find someone to help, and he was not able to. And so he's kind of at his wit's end, right? He's come to Jesus, begging him to step in, all right? So what happens? We get an interruption, right? We get that sandwich structure that I talked about, that Mark is really fond of, and Luke basically reproduces here. It says, as he went, the crowds pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, and though she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. So first of all, is just the description here, that the picture that Luke is painting is of a massive crowd, right, that's around Jesus, and that they're pressing in on Jesus as he potentially is both hearing Jairus and about to respond. And this woman is somewhere in this crowd, probably relatively close to him. There are a couple of descriptions, obviously, in verses, particularly in verse 43, that link the woman to the girl. A couple little details, and yet also differentiate the two of them. The first is that the woman, it says, has been struggling for 12 years. And oh, lo and behold, the daughter, 12 years old, right? So there's a linkage that we get, that we're supposed to see that these two are connected in a certain sense. The second thing we can note, which of course this is distinct here, and that's kind of where we're sort of heading. There's sort of a basic belief, and I think here in the NRSV it says from hemorrhages. Other translations will have flow of blood. Most scholars are agreed that this is some form of a gynecological issue that's going on, and the fact that this woman has been struck with this for 12 years is pretty remarkable, actually, if you think about it. Well, what does this mean? This renders this woman, I mean, when a woman got her period, in Jewish law, I'm not saying that this is fair, but this was just the assumption, she was understood in a sense to be unclean. And not only, is she unclean, but if it's 12 years, she's no longer able to produce an heir, a child. We don't really know exactly how old she is, but for 12 years, she hasn't been able to get pregnant. So unclean and unproductive, and therefore essentially a social pariah. The fact that she's actually in this crowd in and of itself is a little bit of a risk, because she really shouldn't be there, because if someone else touched her, they would be rendered unclean. So the fact that she's actually there is kind of interesting in and of itself. And then the text tells us that she had spent all of her money, right? So she's broke. So we're entering into like I think, or we're getting a picture of a woman who is on the edge or already living in destitution, probably, right? Someone who is in real serious jeopardy in terms of their ability to be a viable person in their community. So what happens? This woman is filled with courage. That's basically what happens. That's verse 44, right? She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his clothes, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. And of course, again, if you go to the Markan text, you get a little bit more detail in there. But the woman, right, she's the fact that she's in the crowd is itself already a risk. And the fact that she reaches out to touch Jesus is a risk, unless she really truly believes that Jesus is a source of divine power, which is what she has heard. I think it's in the Gospel of Mark that we get an internal, right, conversation in her head where she says, if I only touch the hem of his garment, I will be healed. We don't get that here in Luke, but there's a certain sense in which she has come to know and to believe that Jesus is somehow to be associated with God, God's mercy, and God's power. And so her reaching out is her responding to that knowledge. And I think that's a good way, it seems to me, to understand what Jesus will say back to her. All right, then one of the most, I think the next couple verses is one of the really, it's one of the most remarkable parts about the story. Then Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowd surround you and press in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed that power had gone out from me." All right. So I think this is remarkable, in part because this is one of the few places in the gospel stories where Jesus is configured as a passive person, right? He is not the one who actively reaches out to the woman. He's not interacting with her. He is passive, essentially. she reaches out for him, and the power goes out from him. He does not actively dispense it, in other words. And there's a certain sense in which this foreshadows the cross, right, where Jesus himself is incapacitated. There's also something else. I don't have anything here on the screen, but there was a really interesting insight that one interpreter of this passage noted. And that was that, in a sense, Jesus becomes leaky like this woman is leaky. He becomes like her. And in his case, he does not render others unclean, he renders them clean. So there's a certain kind of interesting thing where Jesus identifies with this woman on a deep, deep level, or at least the way that the story is told is that he takes up the posture that's very similar to the woman, and in doing so actually heals her. So I love that as just an insight to sit with, even though I don't have it here for the screen. All right. So we have Jesus's kind of question to Peter, and Peter's kind of, I think, somewhat understandable response. There's all kinds of people around you. What do you mean, who touched you? Everybody's touching you, right, all the time. So what do we get? We get, again, I'll pick it up in 46. But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed the power had gone out from me. When the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace.'" So, first of all, and here's this an interesting kind of piece of art that sort of depicts this scene. The woman is put into the posture of one who has to confess or to proclaim, right, what had happened. Right, she comes forward and does basically what Jairus has done, but in her case, it's after the fact. So Jairus has come and throws himself down at Jesus's feet, asking for healing. She comes forward, throws herself down at Jesus's feet, confessing that he's healed her. Right, so you see the parallel there in an interesting way. And Jesus's response is really so beautiful, because it's tantamount to restoration, basically. "Daughter, your faith has made you well." So Jesus's words echo words that we've heard before, in a sense, right? The woman has, in a sense, I think, and this was kind of the point I was trying to make before, particularly with the other versions, my cat and dog are literally trying together to climb all over me. So I'm sorry, you're driving me crazy. Leave me alone. Okay, back to the point at issue. As I mentioned before, in the Markan version, we get this kind of internal dialogue that the woman has. And I think the presumption, or what we need to assume to make that dialogue make sense, is that she's already heard something about Jesus. So she's already heard something and she's believed it, and her responding to that is reaching out, right? And so that's kind of where there's an interesting thing here. So as I say here, the woman's response fits with the overarching message that those who hear the word are the ones who do it, right? So she's been obedient, in a sense, to the promise that in Jesus is God's mercy and God's power. I think that's kind of seems to me to be a good way, I think, of reading this. And then Jesus's own declaration to her, it's particularly the daughter, right? When he addresses her as daughter, he's basically restoring her to the community. He's saying that you are a daughter of Abraham. You are a daughter of this community. And this also, of course, links her to the daughter that we're about to hear about in just a second. So it's a really interesting, but what I love about it is the restorational element, right? The woman is, in a sense, she's no longer going to be unclean. Perhaps she's not going to be unproductive. We don't really know that for sure. But at the very least, she can be restored to her people. right? And when we get sort of, up into chapter 19, we hear similar kinds of things about Zacchaeus, right, who gets restored and is called a son of Abraham. And so this language of daughter and son is so kind of intimate in a way. All right, what kind of time we got here? So we're over 8:05. What kind of comments or questions do you have? Because I'd love to be able to end or at least complete the second, like the last portion of the story. Maybe we should do that.
Let's do it.
All right, let me move that forward. And then at the end, if there's some comments or questions, we can do that. All right, can I get a volunteer who is willing to read our
Leroy.
passage?
Yep. While he was still speaking, someone came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher any longer." And when Jesus heard this, he replied, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be saved." When he came to the house, he did not allow anyone to enter with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. They were all weeping and wailing for her, but he said, "Do not weep, for she is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But he took her up by the hand and called out, "Child, get up." Her spirit returned, and she got up at once, and then he directed them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astounded, but he ordered them to tell no one what had happened.
All right. So, it's kind of such an interesting, right, ending, but it's the kind that you need sort of to allow the whole thing, because as I said, these two stories are kind of talking to each other in a direct and indirect way. Let's see here. All right. So 49 and 50, right? While he's still speaking, someone comes up. "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher any longer." And when Jesus heard this, he replied, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be saved." So I think we can say, it seems to me, or we should make two observations. One is that a girl was sick and she died, right? That's sort of and that's like, and this is what I mean, the situation seems to have ended like so many others. Death had its way, right? The victory of death. But Jesus intervenes in this, right? And I would suggest it's helpful here to think about Jesus's address to Jairus in light of the woman standing there, like, because remember, Jairus throws himself at his feet, and it doesn't tell us that they keep walking or whatever. It just says the woman reaches out. So in a sense, Jairus has been watching this whole interchange, right? And so it seems to me that Jesus's response is, I mean, in some sense, he's pointing to the woman and he's saying, "Only believe," right? This woman believed what she had heard about me, and she reached out, and look what happened. I mean, so I think it's that kind of, it carries that kind of connotation, it seems to me. So they're kind of a commending of the faith of the woman who was unclean to him. And what you're going to experience if you do that is a reversal of what you normally think should happen, the way that things normally happen. And of course, that is what happens. So then they approached the house, right? Verse 51. When he came to the house, he did not allow anyone to enter with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Just a couple things here. One is the delimiting of an audience, right? I think I couldn't really find a great explanation for this other than the idea that there's a certain sense of entering into a holy presence, and then only a few are going to be allowed into that. Because, you don't just throw, your pearls to swine kind of idea, right? Only a few. And this really, interestingly enough, is the first time in the Gospel of Luke, at least, that we hear about this inner circle of Peter, James, and John. We'll hear a couple more times about them. So we actually starting to get a structure that there are disciples, that there's a core of 12. So there's a bigger group of disciples, probably, if we include the scene of 70, there's a group of 12, and then there's this group of 3 inside of that. So it kind of gives you a sense of the organization of the Jesus movement. And then we get this scene with probably including professional weepers, because that was certainly something that happened in the ancient world. Text doesn't necessarily tell us that, but I think we can assume it. They're all weeping and wailing for her, but he said, "Do not weep, for she is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. And right, so weeping is, of course, the normal response in the face of death, even if you have to pay for that, which is possible that that's what this was. So they laugh in part, and I don't know what the nature of their laughing is. I didn't get a chance to really look at the word that's used there, if it's like a sarcastic or uncontrollable. I would just say that they find his words incomprehensible, and just, maybe even they think they're stupid. I mean, I don't know. But one of the interesting parallels, right, is the laughter of Sarah, right? When she's told that she's going to give birth at her advanced age to a son, she laughs at Yahweh. And so I would see that as the proper parallel to this. So then what happens? Well, Jesus goes into the room, right? So, but he took her by the hand and called out, "Child, get up." Her spirit returned and she got up at once. Then he directed them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astounded, but he had ordered them to tell no one what had happened. And here, as I mentioned, I kind of have this word of the Creator as a sort of echo into other places in the Old and New Testament, where we see that which is unclean cannot render God ineffective, right? Jesus here, just like with the woman was unclean and she reached out and touched Jesus. And rather than making Jesus unclean, he cleansed her. Here, that dynamic is reversed. And in this case, it's Jesus. And it's so intimate, because it says he takes her by the hand, right? He doesn't just call out to her, he takes her by the hand. He touches her corpse, and then he speaks to her, right? And in so doing, brings her back, right? He makes clean that which is unclean. And I think the implication here, of course, is that there is no place, there is no one that is beyond Jesus's reach. And that Yahweh, in a sense, is telling us, showing us in and through Jesus, that central to Yahweh's work is the overthrowing of the power of death. That is central to what God intends and what God seeks to carry out, and will carry out at the end of all things as well. Then you get this really wonderful, I've heard actually sermons on verse 35, right, where her physical needs, the first thing that happens, right, is her physical needs are cared for. He directs them to give her something to eat. And then we get kind of this is kind of a unique spot in Luke. It's actually much more common in Mark. Mark has this whole strand of kind of the Messianic Secret, where you're, like people, like Jesus telling people, don't say anything about this or that. And actually, this is unique, even if we compare it to what just happened in the Gerasene region. Jesus doesn't tell that guy to go and like hang out in his village and not talk to anybody. He tells him to go tell people what I did. But here there's a sort of, and this could then be, I suppose, left over from Mark. So it's my point in all saying all this is it's hard to know precisely how to interpret this. But one interpretation that's been offered is that perhaps the reason for the instruction is that the full secret or the full power of the kingdom is not really to be known until after Jesus' resurrection. I don't have a much better thing to offer you. I don't fully find that totally satisfying, but that's kind of one of the interpretations that's out there, and that at least gives us something to think about. All right. I'm going to stop share. And now we can have a, goodness gracious, 8:15. Look at us.
We got started late though, remember?
That's true. That's right. We had some COVID talk first. Any comments or